Hi, my name is Bob Brown, and I want to welcome you to my On3 Tuolumne Forks Lumber Company layout. Some of you may recognize me as the editor of the Narrow Gauge and Shortline Gazette magazine. Without your support and the magazine, I would not have had the beautiful layout room that you're going to see in this video. I stumbled into the hobby in 1944 when I found the October 1944 copy of Model Railroader at a newsstand. I was only 12. Shortly after that, my parents got a permanent residence, so I was able in 1946 to subscribe to the Model Railroader. And by 1948-49, I had a HON3 layout in my parents' garage. HON3 was kind of uncommon then, but I was inspired by seeing John Allen's Devil's Gulch and Helen's Gone Railroad and Larry Grabber's Thief River and Chugwater layout, especially the models, the cars, the rolling stock they were building and the scenery they were doing. It really inspired me. About 1959 or 60, I got in with a group of ON3 modelers at Cliff Grant's house. We used to meet once a month, the fourth Friday of the month, at his house, and some of those modelers were really interested in fine scale standards in standard gauge and ON3, and I got in with them. After building some models, I thought, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a newsletter about these fine scale standards that were called 1/4 inch AAR in those days. Now they're P48. And so I started a little 4-page magazine called Fine Lines that I literally ditto mastered, ran off on ditto masters on my school ditto machine. If you're of a certain age, you will know, you remember those ditto masters because they smelled so wonderful and felt a bit wet. For about 11 years, I published Fine Lines, and it was built up into a rather nice 24-page magazine. But in 1975, my printer and I became partners and decided to produce a new magazine called the Narrow Gauge and Shortline Gazette. After about 2 years, my wife Irene and I bought the printer out and began publishing the magazine on our own. We had an office in downtown Los Altos, and it meant Irene, who was now managing the magazine instead of teaching at Stanford, she decided she didn't want to commute back and forth, so we decided to add an office onto the house. And our contractor suggested that we put a second floor room in for a model railroad. Neither Irene nor I had thought about doing this, but it was a good idea. So I gained a beautiful purpose-built room for my model railroad, and Irene gained a 20-foot commute every morning and night. The layout is about 19 by 20 feet, and it's Elgar benchwork that is 3 banker's boxes high, so I can store things underneath it. All the visible track is hand-laid, code 70 and code 100 rail, and it was originally powered by a PFM sound system for about 30 years, but about 10 years ago I went to easy CVP DCC, and now I have a DCC control layout. My primary interest is in logging, overlaid with a tourist railroad. My logging equipment is inspired by West Side Lumber Company, Michigan California Lumber Company, and Diamond and Caldor. And the tourist line with its tourist hotel, which I'll tell you about later, was inspired by the Lake Tahoe Railway and Transportation Company, a line that once ran from Truckee down to the lake. I enjoy doing interior details of industrial buildings and making scenes of people doing different activities I call vignettes. I've become known, I think, for the clutter on my railroad. Everywhere you look, you'll find a wrench or a spade or oil drum. In fact, some of my friends say when I make a mistake, I cover it with a bucket. Okay, this is the main sawmill on my layout. It's patterned after the Pino Grande sawmill on the Michigan California Lumber Company. It's a twin sawmill. On the right side, you see the log haul pulling logs up to cut them into boards. The left-hand sawmill was for sinkers, or logs that had become waterlogged and sank down and had to be lifted up and put on a cart and pulled into the sawmill to be processed. There were a couple of dumps on the other side for dumping the logs off. This is pretty accurate to the Pino Grande mill. However, this is also an example of how you should plan ahead, because I built the mill over a long period of time, working on it and then stopping and coming back and working on it. And I built a platform with a transfer table at the back end, like the prototype, where they had little four-wheel cars that they put cut lumber on and moved it back and forth as to where they wanted it to go. And I finally, when Charles Bromer brought out his line of sawmill machinery, I got a hold of it and I started putting it together, and I found to my horror that my deck was a good 8 inches too short. So I had to extend the deck out, which now extends out over the transfer table. And it kind of makes it silly to have a transfer table there. But it's interesting, no one's ever said anything in the last 40 years about that. So they're either being polite or they haven't noticed. In front of that is the boiler house and then the blacksmith shop. And my repair shed is right out in front here, where you can look into it and see the interior detail, which I call clutter. You notice that my buildings don't have sides, or in some cases roofs. And this is because I don't like taking the roofs off of the building to show the interior. So I've made the buildings so the interiors show without the walls and the roofs. Here's a tractor shed, which logically wouldn't have walls on it, so I was able to leave them off. But it has a full interior, including tools in the drawers and the workbenches. And it's the kind of thing I really enjoy doing. Also, one other simple example of interiors is this saw filer's shed. Notice the skylights and the roofs, so the saw filer gets the maximum amount of light. And the interior of the saw filer's shed has the special vise for holding saws. And these sheds were spaced around the woods so the saw filers could keep the saw sharp as they cut the timber in the woods. The stamp mill is a kit from Western Skill Models. And Bill Gustafson, who was the owner of Western Skill Models, knew I never put roofs on my interiors, so he sent me a kit less the roof. So I didn't have a roof to put on. So you see it now without the roof, with all the details showing, but that's all Western Skill Models details. The last thing to talk about in this part of the layout is my red light district. All Western layouts should have a red light district, but because a sense of propriety, we're not going to show you what's going on inside those little cribs. About 1960, a friend of mine mentioned that he'd met an On3 modeler who lived over in Boulder Creek. Would I like to go over and see him? And I said, sure. So I went over and met Bill Coffey, the late Bill Coffey, unfortunately. And Bill had built this little engine house, and he had filled it with Cerobin detail castings. And I was absolutely blown away by seeing this model. And I was so excited that Bill gave me a baggie full of Cerobin castings. And I came home and built a bunkhouse with an interior using the castings. Later, Bill showed me how to make my own castings, do the patterns, do the RTV molds. He helped me make a casting machine, and I got on to doing what I call clutter and doing this detailing that you've seen so far. The little locomotive was built by Bill for a 1968 NMRA contest, and it's totally scratch built. And believe it or not, it only won a second place. But Bill Coffey had the greatest influence on me of any other modeler, in the magazines or not. And when I came home from seeing his models, I actually threw everything away and started over. Some of you maybe remember the Loma Prieta earthquake in the Bay Area of 1989. Actually knocked one section out of the Bay Bridge and flattened a double-level freeway over in Oakland, killing a number of people. But I had a bookshelf behind me which fell down on the layout and smashed the garage down as you see it here. I was so pleased with the way it smashed down that I left it alone and put a sign in it. It's what I would call posh clutter, to make a model to this detail and smash it down Fortunately, Mother Nature did it for me. But where I have extremely expensive or highly detailed clutter, I call it posh clutter, and this traction engine is an example of that kind of clutter. So visitors seem to like to look at the way this is crashed down, and I'm glad I left it the way it is. Most Western towns need a Chinatown, and so this is my short Chinatown. Charlie Getz, who was a longtime columnist for the Narrow Gauge and Shortline Gazette, is married to a Chinese woman who made the Chinese signs for me. But Charlie, being a wit, told me that he felt that the signs said, "Read my main competitor, mainline modeler." But Margaret assures me that they say melons and strawberries and that sort of thing. It would be perfect for such a scene. The first building here is Tom York's first building, which was made of wood. Most of you will know Tom York did plaster buildings. The second building was scratch built, and the next two buildings are Tom York plaster buildings. As I mentioned in my introduction, my railroad features a logging line. It also features a tourist line that which is inspired by the Lake Tahoe Railway and Transportation Company. This railroad, it was a 3-foot gauge line that once ran from Truckee, California, down to the shore of Lake Tahoe to a fancy world-class hotel called the Tahoe Tavern. At one time, you could get onto a Southern Pacific Pullman car in Oakland, California, go to sleep, and wake up in the next morning in Truckee, where you would get off, get on a little narrow gauge train, go down along a river to the Tahoe Tavern, where you would get off, check in, go to your room, and your luggage was already in your room waiting for you. The Tahoe Tavern was built in 1901. And back in those days, people who enjoyed automobiles were called automobilists, and they liked to take tours. So one of the tours they would take would be from Sacramento up to Lake Tahoe, go around the lake, and come back. And it was known as the Wishbone Route. But the problem was, how did you get gasoline? So what the Lake Tahoe Railway did is they bought 2 tank cars, painted them white for some reason, and hauled gasoline from Truckee down to a pier on the lake, where it was offloaded onto a barge and barged around the lake and spotted for these people who were driving their cars around the lake on the tour. But it's difficult to haul a tank car full of gasoline in a passenger train, so they were known as the White Elephants. The Tahoe Tavern was, as I mentioned, a world-class hotel. During the 20s, all the movie stars would go up there and all the sports stars. And in the 30s, it became a little more tawdry, and they built a casino, and it became a little more a gambling place. And it was finally torn out in 1963. If you Google Tahoe Tavern today, you can rent a condo up there, so there's still a presence of the tavern. Now, I devoted quite a bit of my layout to my tavern, which I call the Tahoe Inn. If I'd really built it in full size, it would take the whole length of the room here. It was a huge building. I don't know why I have this interest in taverns. I've got 2 major hotels on my layout. I've tried to represent as many of the things to do that my hotel people would want to do. I've got a little railroad, and I've got some other attractions for them. Notice the tour bus has just come in with a load of people, their luggage, fancy automobile. And I've got people playing croquet here, the croquet wickets, playing croquet while some elderly people watch. I was in England several years ago, and I found some painted figures of people playing golf. So I had to buy them and bring them back and set up a putting green. Notice the people watching what's going on in the lake, people swimming. I have a small railroad running around, which I just put in. It's about 15-inch gauge in O-scale. I still have to change the locomotive to get an O-scale driver in it and make a little train of people. Over on the other side of the scene, you'll find a fire circle. Anybody who's gone to a summer camp has been in a fire circle. And there's a little station for the railroad, a gazebo, a woman riding a horse, people having a picnic. And further on over, you can see a place where you can rent a horse And again, further on is a horseshoe pitch and people shooting. I'm not sure what they're shooting, but there's people in a tree shooting at something. Along this side of the layout, in addition to the Tahoe Inn, I built a boatworks, which on an inlet with its own little trestle. And there were several boatworks around the Lake Tahoe in the early days. In fact, there was quite a fleet of steamboats running around the lake transporting people. Towards the end, I produced a very small little town with a migrant truck in it. I was raised in Modesto in the late 30s, and we had a lot of migrants coming through from Oklahoma from the Dust Bowl. And I thought I would represent one of these in a little truck with a broken down tire, sort of Grapes of Wrath kind of picture. And also I have a giant orange in there that I remember as a child driving along and stopping and getting a ice cold drink of orange juice during the summer during the Second World War. And there's a scene that ends off with a mine that I happen to have and put it in there. A lot of my track is simply to store models. I don't operate them. I simply make places to put them. And this is a perfect example of this small yard near the Tahoe Inn. At one end, I have my version of the white elephants with the pier and the barge to barge the gas around the lake. Next is a very early model I built of a sawmill that was written up by Jack Work in about a 1960 model railroader. That seems to have followed my layouts around. And then this last building is a engine shed with a donkey repair facility attached to it. And it's one of my interiors. I'm pleased with it. It was fun to do, and it has a lot of donkey details in it. This photograph above my layout caused a lot of modelers to build models of the scene. It's a scene of a lime kiln in Boulder Creek, California, that was once served by the South Pacific Coast Narrow Gauge. The late Paul Scholes built a model of it, wrote it up in the Narrow Gauge Gazette, and then the late Jim Vail did the same thing. I decided a few years ago to build a model of it myself. You notice it's built above my workbench, which is a good place. Sometimes people forget there's room above your workbench for a layout. So you might keep that in mind. You can put lights under it to light up your work area, and it's kind of out of the way, and it's nice and high. My scene starts with a stave mill over here, fully detailed interior with stave making machines. Chunks of seasoned wood would be delivered to the stave mill, and they go through a series of saws, which would make them into the banana shapes of a barrel stave. From here, they would be moved down to the cooperage, where they would be turned into barrels. And my cooperage shows the barrels under construction and the hoop making machines holding the staves in shape. Once the barrels were made, they were shipped over to the lime kilns, where they were loaded up and then shipped back to the warehouse to be stored and shipped out by ship up to San Francisco. One of the reasons I modeled logging railroads is that I like the uniqueness of the equipment. Most logging railroads built their own rolling stock and bought their locomotives. Some logging railroads built their locomotives as well. In this picture, there are two very unique cars from the Michigan-California Lumber Company. The car on the right was a portable water car that was hauled up to the donkey engines, filled with water, and then used as a reservoir to water up the boilers for the donkeys. I don't think they would have put water in it and moved it, because the water would have derailed the car. The car on the left is what was known as a hog car. It was designed to haul chunks of wood up to the donkeys and to fuel them. I saw both of these cars up at Camino near Placerville in California and photographed them and built models from my photographs. Most logging railroads had small cabooses, which is another thing I like about them. The caboose shown here was my first On3 model, and is about 65 years old and still running on my layout. The second caboose I'm showing you is a prize winner. It won first place in cabooses at the 1971 NMRA convention in London and the United Transportation Union's Brass Lantern Award. In the background, there's a saw filer's car. These cars were taken out into the woods, and the saw filers would sharpen the saws using the materials in the cars. The car next to it is a wooden water tank car. I also like Deere locomotives such as Heislers and Shays and Climaxes. I have a number of Shays, but unfortunately they're all equipped with PFM sound systems and I can't run them today. But I do have one homemade wooden locomotive, typical of a Loki, and it runs quite well. That's shown here with a train of four-wheel cars. I'm kind of proud of this little railroad. I call it Shoehorn because it's shoehorned into this alcove over my roll-top desk. When I was teaching, I spent many an hour correcting papers and planning lessons at this desk. But when I stopped teaching, I actually made the waterfront of Shoehorn cantilever out over the stairway. So as you come up the stairway, you're actually coming under the layout. Actually, there are two railroads. There's a standard gauge fine scale railroad that runs around from the waterfront just to underneath the mine. I don't have a locomotive or anything to run on that one, so it doesn't have electricity. But the other layout is a narrow gauge 30-inch line, On3, and it runs around past the Shoehorn Brewery up to the Shoehorn Mine. And it just runs back and forth, but it was a lot of fun to build, and it made good use of the space that I had available. I hope you enjoyed our tour of my On3 Tuolumne Forks Lumber Company layout. I've enjoyed building it in this wonderful room that was made possible by the readers of the Gazette and their support. I hope the next time you go into your local hobby shop, you'll pick up a copy of the Gazette and take a look at it. It's full of the best articles by some of the best model railroaders in the country, and it's not just narrow gauge. There's a lot of technique articles that you can use on your standard gauge railroads. So next time you can go into your hobby shop, pick it up, take a look at it, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you.
Saying that we don't need to have him stay with you?
Good.
Why are we doing this?
Oh.
Well, we got lucky on that.